Three men in expensive suits had Rebecca Martinez pinned against the booth at Romano's family restaurant, and nobody was doing anything about it. The single father at table 6, the one with paint under his fingernails who'd been cutting pizza, for his 8-year-old daughter, set down his fork and stood up slowly. What happened next took exactly 15 seconds. One man's arm twisted behind his back with a sickening crack, another face down on the checkered floor, and the third one backing away with his hands raised in surrender. The entire restaurant fell, silent as Ryan Carter dusted off his work shirt, his daughter barely looking up from her coloring book. "My daddy was in the Navy," Zoe announced to the stunned room as if that explained how a quiet plumber could move like a weapon designed for war. But as Rebecca stared at her unlikely savior, she couldn't shake the feeling that 15 seconds had just changed everything, and that this soft-spoken man with calloused hands carried secrets that ran deeper than anyone in Cedar Falls could imagine. Romano's family restaurant had been Ryan Carter's Friday night tradition for 3 years running, ever since he'd moved to Cedar Falls with Zoe after everything fell apart. The red vinyl booze, the smell of garlic bread, and the gentle chatter of families created a cocoon of normally that he desperately needed. Tonight felt different, though, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. He'd learned to trust those instincts during his 8 years as a Navy SEAL, and they'd kept him alive in places where trusting the wrong shadow meant never coming home. Cedar Falls was supposed to be different, supposed to be safe. But as he watched his daughter color a picture of a seahorse, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that danger was sitting just 3 tables away. Rebecca Martinez had arrived 20 minutes ago, alone and visibly nervous, checking her phone every few seconds with the kind of urgency that spoke of real trouble. She'd ordered coffee but hadn't touched it, her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to read the menu. Ryan recognized the signs. Someone running from something. Someone who knew they were being watched. He'd positioned himself and Zoe at table 6 deliberately back to the wall. Clear view of all entrances, old habits that his daughter thought were just Daddy being particular about where they sat. The other patrons seemed oblivious to the tension, lost in their own Friday night conversations. But Ryan felt it building like pressure before a storm. "Daddy, why does that lady look scared?" Zoe whispered, her crayon pausing over the seahorse's tail. She had her mother's intuition, that uncanny ability to read people that had both blessed and cursed the women in Ryan's life. He glanced at Rebecca again, noting how she kept looking toward the exit, how her shoulders hunched with each new customer who walked through the door. "Sometimes grown-ups have worries, sweetheart," Ryan said softly, cutting another piece of pizza for his daughter. "Just like how you worry about math tests, but bigger." He kept his voice calm, reassuring, but his eyes continued their systematic sweep of the restaurant. 3 men in expensive suits had just walked in, and everything about their body language screamed trouble. The men didn't bother looking at menus or waiting to be seated. They moved with purpose toward Rebecca's table, their expensive Italian, shoes clicking against the checkered linoleum floor like a countdown timer. The leader was built like a linebacker, with graying temples and hands that had seen violence. His companions flanked him with military precision, cutting off Rebecca's escape routes with practiced ease. Ryan felt his muscles tense, his breathing automatically shifting to the controlled rhythm he'd learned in Coronado. Zoe was still coloring, humming softly to herself, completely unaware that her safe Friday night was about to shatter. "Miss Martinez," the leader said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made other conversations falter. "You've been avoiding our calls." Rebecca's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, her face pale but defiant. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped to a whisper as other patrons sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way animals feel earthquakes before they hit. "I told you people I'm not interested," Rebecca said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Find another lawyer." The man in the suit smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He slid into the booth across from her uninvited, while his companions remained standing, blocking her in. Ryan's grip tightened on his fork, every instinct screaming at him to move. But Zoe was right there, and he'd sworn never to let violence touch her world again. "See? That's where you're wrong, counselor," the man continued, his tone conversational but loaded with threat. "You don't get to walk away from Victor Castellanos. Not when you know what you know." He leaned forward, and Rebecca instinctively pressed back against the booth. "So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw from the Henderson case. You're going to forget everything you think you discovered, and you're going to go back to handling divorce cases and parking tickets. Like a good little lawyer." The ceramic plate hit the wall inches from Rebecca's face before anyone could react, white fragments scattering across the red vinyl seat. One of the men had swept it off the table in a casual display of violence, and now all three were leaning over her, their voices dropping to harsh whispers that carried more menace than shouts ever could. Other patrons were starting to leave, sensing the danger, but unwilling to get involved. The waitress had disappeared behind the counter, probably calling the police, but Ryan knew they wouldn't arrive in time. "Daddy." Zoe's voice was small, confused, her crayon frozen over the coloring book. Ryan looked at his daughter's wide eyes, saw the fear creeping in, and something inside him clicked into place. He'd retired from the teams to give Zoe a normal life, to protect her from the darkness he'd lived in for 8 years. But sometimes protecting innocence meant embracing violence one more time. Ryan Carter stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet restaurant. The men at Rebecca's table hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on intimidating their target, but Rebecca's eyes found his across the room. She saw something there that made her breath catch. Not the mild-mannered plumber who always said please and thank you, but something harder, more dangerous, something that had been sleeping for 3 years and was now fully awake. "Excuse me," Ryan said, his voice carrying clearly across the restaurant. The 3 men turned toward him, and their leader's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation as he took in Ryan's work clothes, his paint-stained hands, his utterly ordinary appearance. "Mind your own business, pal," the leader said dismissively. "This is a private conversation." But something in Ryan's stillness, in the way he held himself, made the man's companions shift nervously. They were hired muscle, probably ex-military, themselves, and they recognized something in Ryan's bearing that civilian eyes missed. "I am minding my business," Ryan replied, taking a step closer. "My business is making sure my daughter can finish her dinner in peace. Your business seems to be scaring people. I think we have a conflict of interest." His voice remained calm, conversational, but there was steel underneath that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. The leader stood up, all 6'4" in of him, probably expecting the slight plumber to back down. Instead, Ryan moved with fluid precision, closing the distance between them in 3 steps. What happened next took exactly 15 seconds, but it unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of controlled violence. Ryan's hand shot out, grabbed the leader's wrist, and twisted with surgical precision. The crack of bone echoed through the restaurant as the man's arm bent at an impossible angle. Before the leader hit the ground, Ryan had already moved to the second man, using his momentum to drive an elbow into the man's solar plexus. The attacker folded like a house of cards, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man reached for something inside his jacket, but Ryan was already there, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist with enough force to make him drop whatever he'd been reaching for. A gentle push sent him stumbling backward into an empty table, hands raised in surrender. The entire restaurant fell silent except for the groaning of the 2 men on the floor and the soft scratch of Zoe's crayon against paper. Ryan straightened his work shirt and walked back to his table as if nothing had happened, but his eyes never left the 3 men. The leader was struggling to his feet, cradling his broken wrist, his face a mask of pain and rage. "This isn't over," he snarled. But Ryan just looked at him with the kind of cold patience that spoke of deeper violence held in check. "Yes, it is," Ryan said simply. "You're going to leave now. You're going to forget about Miss Martinez. And if I see you or anyone like you bothering innocent people in my town again, We'll have another conversation. Trust me, you won't enjoy that one as much as I will." The quiet authority in his voice made the leader take an involuntary step backward. The three men limped toward the exit, the leader pausing only to glare back at Ryan with the kind of hatred that promised future violence. But Ryan had seen that look before in a dozen different countries from 100 different enemies. It didn't scare him anymore. What scared him was the way Zoe was looking at him now, her coloring book forgotten, her young mind trying to process what she'd just witnessed. "My daddy was in the Navy," Zoe announced to the room, her voice matter-of-fact, in the way only children could manage. "He protected people from bad guys like on TV, but real." She went back to coloring her seahorse as if her father dismantling 3 armed men was just another Friday night occurrence. Rebecca Martinez sat in her booth, staring at Ryan Carter with an expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and something that might have been recognition. Her hands were no longer shaking, but her mind was racing, trying to reconcile the quiet man who always ordered extra napkins for his daughter with the precision instrument of violence she'd just witnessed. She'd seen combat footage before, had interviewed enough veterans to recognize the difference between street fighting and military training. This man wasn't just former military. He was something special, something dangerous that had been hiding, in plain sight. "Thank you," she called out softly. But Ryan was already back at his table cutting pizza for Zoe as if the last 2 minutes had never happened. Other patrons were slowly returning to their conversations. The immediate danger passed, but an undercurrent of tension remained. People were looking at Ryan differently now, seeing past the work clothes and paint-stained hands to something harder underneath. Ryan could feel their stares, could sense the shift in how people perceived him, and it made his chest tight with familiar anxiety. This was exactly what he'd tried to avoid when he'd moved to Cedar Falls, exactly why he'd chosen the most ordinary job he could find. He wanted to be nobody special, just another single dad trying to raise his daughter in peace. But violence had a way of following him, and now his carefully constructed normal life felt as fragile as the ceramic plate that had started this whole mess. "Daddy, are you okay?" Zoe asked, her small hand reaching across the table to touch his. Her concern was genuine, immediate, and it reminded Ryan why he'd given up everything that made him who he was. This little girl with her mother's eyes and her endless capacity for love was worth any sacrifice, any loss of identity. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, just making sure everyone could enjoy their dinner. But as he looked around the restaurant, seeing the mixture of fear and fascination in people's faces, Ryan knew that his quiet life in Cedar Falls had just become infinitely more complicated. Rebecca Martinez was still sitting, in her booth, her untouched coffee now cold, her phone buzzing with what were probably more threats from Victor Castellanos' organization. She kept looking at Ryan as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. There was something familiar about the way he'd moved, something that tickled the edges of her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. The police arrived. 20 minutes later, but the 3 men were long gone, and the restaurant security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial 15 seconds. Ryan gave a statement that was technically true, but revealed nothing about his background, describing himself as a concerned citizen who'd intervened when he saw someone being threatened. The officers were skeptical, but had no choice but to accept his version of events, especially when every witness corroborated his story. As the police wrapped up their investigation, Rebecca approached Ryan's table. Zoe had finished her seahorse and moved on to a dolphin, her artistic focus unbroken by the evening's excitement. Ryan tensed as Rebecca drew near, every instinct telling him to keep his distance, to maintain the walls he'd built around his new life. "I want to thank you properly," Rebecca said, her voice low enough that Zoe wouldn't overhear. What you did tonight, those men weren't just making idle threats. They're connected to some very dangerous people, and what you just did probably saved my life. She paused, studying his face. "But I'm guessing you already knew that." Ryan met her gaze steadily, seeing intelligence there and determination that reminded him of another strong woman from his past. "I saw someone in trouble," he said simply. "I couldn't just sit there." But something in Rebecca's expression made him uneasy, as if she was seeing more than he wanted to reveal. "You moved like military," Rebecca continued, ignoring his attempt to deflect. "Not just any military, special forces, probably Navy, given what your daughter said." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've represented enough veterans to recognize the signs. The question is, what's a former Navy SEAL doing working as a plumber in Cedar Falls, Iowa?" Ryan's blood ran cold. This woman was dangerous in a completely different way than the men he'd just faced. Dangerous because she was smart enough to see through his carefully constructed facade. "I think you're letting your imagination run away." "With you," he said carefully. "I fix pipes and raise my daughter. That's all." But Rebecca wasn't deterred. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, setting it on the table between them. "Those men tonight work for Victor Castellanos. He's trying to cover up a defense contracting scandal that goes deeper than you can imagine. People have died to keep this secret, and more will die if someone doesn't stop it." She met his eyes again. "I could use someone with your particular skill set." "I'm not interested," Ryan said firmly, but he didn't push the card away. "My fighting days are over. I have more important responsibilities now." He glanced at Zoe, who was adding intricate details to her dolphin's fins, completely absorbed in her art. "Captain Benjamin Rodriguez," Rebecca said quietly, and Ryan's entire world seemed to tilt sideways. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Rodriguez had been his commanding officer in Afghanistan, a man of absolute integrity who'd died trying to protect his team from an ambush that should never have happened. "How do you know that name?" Ryan's voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity behind it made Rebecca take a half-step back. She'd obviously hit something important, but the pain in Ryan's eyes made her regret her tactics. "Because Captain Rodriguez was my father," Rebecca said softly. "And, according to his final mission report, he died saving the life of Petty Officer Ryan Carter and his entire team. He died because someone sold faulty equipment to the military. The same someone I've been investigating for the past 6 months." The coloring book slipped from Zoe's fingers as she looked up at the two adults, sensing the shift in emotional temperature. Ryan felt like the walls of the restaurant were closing in, the careful barriers he'd built around his new life crumbling. With each word Rebecca spoke, Captain Rodriguez had been more than his commanding officer. He'd been a mentor, a father figure, the man who taught him that true strength came from protecting others, not destroying enemies. "Daddy?" Zoe's voice was small, concerned, and it snapped Ryan back to the present. Whatever ghosts Rebecca had awakened would have to wait. His daughter needed him here now, in this moment, not lost in the shadows of his past. "We should go," Ryan said, standing abruptly and reaching for his wallet. But Rebecca's hand caught his wrist, and the contact sent an electric shock through both of them. Her grip was firm, desperate, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw the same determination that had driven her father to make the ultimate sacrifice. "Please," she whispered, "I know this is a lot to process, but I need your help. My father died believing he was protecting something important, and I've spent 2 years trying to figure out what that was. The Henderson case, the one those men want me to drop. It's connected to his death. Victor Castellanos supplied the defective body armor that failed my father's unit. If I can prove it, I can finally give him justice." Ryan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of old promises and new responsibilities crushing down on him. He'd sworn to Captain Rodriguez that he'd use his skills to protect the innocent, but he'd also sworn to Zoe that he'd never leave her the way her mother had. The two promises felt incompatible, pulling him in directions that threatened to tear him apart. "I can't," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. I have Zoe to think about. I won't risk leaving her alone." But even as he said the words, he could feel his resolve weakening. Captain Rodriguez had died for him, had taken a bullet meant for Ryan's chest, and that debt had been eating at him for 3 years. Rebecca seemed to understand his internal struggle. She looked at Zoe, who was watching them with the kind of adult perception that some children develop too early, and her expression softened. "What if there was a way to keep her safe while you helped me? I have resources, protection, ways to make sure nothing happens to your daughter." "No," Ryan said firmly, but his hand unconsciously moved to the spot where Captain Rodriguez's dog tags hung beneath his shirt. He'd worn them every day since the funeral, a reminder of the man who'd saved his life and the promise he'd made over a flag-draped coffin. "I won't put her at risk, not for anything." Zoe slipped out of her side of the booth and moved to stand beside her father, her small hand finding his. "Daddy, the scared lady is Captain Rodriguez's daughter?" she asked, her 8-year-old mind cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "The Captain Rodriguez you tell me stories about?" Ryan knelt down to Zoe's level, his hands settling on her small shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart, but those are just stories. This is real life, and real life is more complicated." He could see the wheels turning in her head, could see her mother's, intelligence shining through those dark eyes. "But you always say Captain Rodriguez was a hero," Zoe continued, her voice serious beyond her years. "And heroes help people, right? Even when it's scary." She looked at Rebecca with the kind of direct assessment that only children could manage. "Are you trying to be a hero like your daddy?" Rebecca's breath caught, and for a moment her composed exterior cracked, revealing the grief and determination underneath. "I'm trying," she said honestly, "but I can't do it alone, and your daddy is the only person who can help me finish what my father started." Ryan felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the crushing responsibility of choices that would ripple through multiple lives. Every instinct told him to grab Zoe and run, to disappear into the American heartland, where neither Rebecca Martinez nor Victor Castellanos could find them. But Captain Rodriguez's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that some fights were worth the risk, that protecting the innocent sometimes meant standing in harm's way. "If I help you," Ryan said slowly, "and I'm not saying I will, what exactly are we talking about? What would you need me to do?" Rebecca's eyes lit up with hope, but Ryan held up a hand to stop her from speaking. "And don't lie to me or sugarcoat it. If you want my help, you tell me everything, the whole truth, no matter how ugly it gets." Rebecca glanced at Zoe, uncertain about how much to reveal in front of a child, but Ryan shook his head. "She stays with me. Whatever you have to say, she'll hear eventually anyway. At least this way I can explain it to her properly." It was a test, Ryan realized, a way to gauge how serious Rebecca was about involving him in her crusade. "Victor Castellanos runs a defense contracting company called Meridian Industries," Rebecca began, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a prosecutor laying out a case. "For the past 5 years, they've been supplying body armor to military units overseas. The armor looks good on paper, passes all the basic tests, but it fails under real combat conditions. Your unit wasn't the first to be hit by defective equipment, and it won't be the last unless someone stops them." Ryan's jaw tightened as the implications sank in. "How many?" he asked quietly. "How many soldiers have died because of this?" "At least 47, confirmed." "Probably more," Rebecca replied, her voice heavy with the weight of those numbers. "My father started investigating when he noticed patterns in casualty reports, equipment failures that didn't make sense. He was building a case, gathering evidence, but he died before he could complete it. The official investigation was shut down, all his files classified or destroyed." "Except you have copies," Ryan guessed, seeing the determined set of Rebecca's shoulders. She nodded, reaching into her purse to pull out a small flash drive. "My father was paranoid about security. He kept backup files hidden in places the military investigators didn't think to look. I've spent 2 years piecing together his research, following the paper trail, building a case that can finally bring Castellanos down. But every time I get close, someone tries to stop me. Tonight wasn't the first attempt to scare me off. Zoe had been listening intently, her young mind processing information that would have overwhelmed most adults. So, the bad man is hurting. Soldiers like Captain Rodriguez, she asked, her voice small but fierce, and Miss Rebecca wants to stop him. That's right, sweetheart, Ryan said gently, but stopping bad people can be dangerous work. That's why Daddy doesn't want to get involved. But even as he said it, Ryan could feel his resistance crumbling. The thought of other soldiers dying because of Castellanos' greed, other families, destroyed because he'd chosen safety over justice, was eating at him like acid. But Daddy, Zoe said with the devastating logic of childhood, if you don't help, more soldiers will die, right? And that would make Captain Rodriguez sad. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much wisdom for her age. Mommy always said that doing the right thing is scary, but that's why it's right, because it's hard. Ryan closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed new life crumbling around him. Zoe was right, and Rebecca was right, and somewhere in the darkness beyond death, Captain Rodriguez was probably right too. But that didn't make the choice any easier, didn't reduce the risk to the one person in the world who mattered more to him than his own life. If I do this, he said finally, opening his eyes to meet Rebecca's hopeful gaze, we do it my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks, and Zoe's safety comes first. The moment I think she's in danger, I'm out. No arguments, no negotiations, just gone, are we clear? Rebecca nodded eagerly, relief flooding her features. Crystal clear. I have a safe house, protection detail, everything we need to keep her secure while we work. She paused, studying his face. But I have to ask, why did you really leave the teams? Men, like you, don't usually retire to become plumbers in small-town Iowa. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the spot where his wedding ring used to sit. Zoe's mother died 3 years ago, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Cancer. I was deployed when it happened. Couldn't get back in time to say goodbye. I realized that all my training, all my skills, they meant nothing if I couldn't protect the people I loved most. So I got out, moved here, tried to give Zoe the normal life her mother wanted for her. Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes, and with it came a deep respect for the sacrifice Ryan had made. I'm sorry, she said softly. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. She glanced at Zoe, who was pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. But maybe this is a chance to honor both their memories. Your wife and my father, they'd both want us to stop other families from going through what we've been through. Ryan looked around Romano's family restaurant at the place where he'd tried to build a new life, tried to become someone ordinary and safe. The other patrons were still stealing glances at him, whispering among themselves about the quiet plumber who'd moved like a weapon. His cover was blown, his anonymity shattered, and there was no going back to the simple life he'd tried to create. All right, he said finally, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. I'll help you, but first, I need to make arrangements for Zoe. She'll need somewhere safe to stay while we work. He looked down at his daughter, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and concern that broke his heart. Actually, Rebecca said carefully, I was thinking she could stay with me. I have a house outside town, good security, and I've been living alone for 2 years. It might be safer if we all stayed together, at least until this is over. She met Zoe's curious gaze. I could use some company anyway. It gets pretty lonely working on cases by yourself. Zoe perked up at this suggestion, her natural sociability overcoming her initial shyness. Do you have cable TV? She asked seriously, as if this was the most important factor in the decision. And can I bring my art supplies? Cable TV, high-speed internet, and the biggest art room you've ever seen, Rebecca replied with a smile that was genuine for the first time all evening. I used to paint before law school, never had time to set up a proper studio, but I kept all the supplies. Ryan felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the iron control he'd maintained for 3 years. Maybe this was what Captain Rodriguez had been trying to teach him all along. That strength wasn't about standing alone against the darkness, but about finding the right people to stand with. Maybe it was time to stop running from who he was and start figuring out who he could become. Okay, he said, the decision feeling both terrifying and liberating. We'll do this together. But first, I need to know everything about Victor Castellanos, his organization, and exactly what kind of evidence you have. If we're going to take down a defense contractor, we need to be absolutely certain of our facts. Rebecca's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face and making her look years younger. I have everything we need, she said, patting her purse where the flash drive waited. Financial records, correspondence, test results, casualty reports, everything my father died trying to expose. With your help, we can finally bring these people to justice. As they prepared to leave Romano's family restaurant, Ryan caught sight of their reflection in the window. A single father, a determined lawyer, and a little girl with paint-stained fingers walking into an uncertain future together. It wasn't the family he'd planned, wasn't the life he'd tried to build, but maybe it was exactly what all three of them needed. Outside in the parking lot, Rebecca's phone buzzed with another threatening text message. Ryan read it over her shoulder, his expression hardening as he recognized the kind of intimidation tactics he'd seen in a dozen different countries. Victor Castellanos wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was someone who understood violence and wasn't afraid to use it. They'll escalate now, Ryan said quietly, making sure Zoe couldn't overhear. Tonight was a warning. Tomorrow, they'll start playing for keeps. He looked at Rebecca. Seriously, are you sure you want to do this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. People like Castellanos don't forgive, and they don't forget. Rebecca's expression hardened, and for a moment, Ryan could see the steel that had driven her father to make the ultimate sacrifice. They killed him, she said simply. My father died because he tried to protect soldiers from faulty equipment and they covered it up. If I don't finish what he started, then he died for nothing. Ryan nodded, understanding completely. Some fights were worth the risk. Some promises transcended personal safety. As they walked toward their cars, he felt the familiar weight of mission planning settling over him, the methodical preparation for a battle that would test everything he'd learned in 8 years of special operations. Miss Rebecca, Zoe's voice piped up from between them. Are you going to be like family now? The question was innocent, direct, and it stopped both adults in their tracks. Ryan realized that his daughter, in her simple way, had cut straight to the heart of what they were really doing. They weren't just pursuing justice for Captain Rodriguez. They were creating something new, something that might fill the holes that loss had carved in all their lives. I'd like that very much, Rebecca said softly, kneeling down to Zoe's level. I never had a little sister before. It might be fun. Zoe's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children could manage, and Ryan felt something that had been frozen inside him for 3 years begin to thaw. As they drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls toward Rebecca's house, Ryan caught himself thinking about the future for the first time since his wife's death. Not just survival, not just getting through each day, but actually building something worth protecting. Captain Rodriguez had saved his life in Afghanistan, but maybe Rebecca Martinez was going to save something even more important. Maybe she was going to help him remember how to live. The safe house turned out to be a converted farmhouse 10 mi outside town, surrounded by enough open ground to spot trouble coming from any direction. Ryan approved of the security measures Rebecca had implemented, the discreet cameras and motion sensors that would alert them to any approach. She'd obviously learned from her father's military background, understanding that preparation was the difference between success and disaster. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that invited people to relax and stay a while. Zoe immediately claimed the art room Rebecca had mentioned, her eyes wide with delight at the easels and canvases and tubes of paint arranged on shelves like a rainbow of possibilities. For the first time in hours, Ryan felt some of his tension ease. This could work. They could make this work. So, Rebecca said as Zoe explored her new temporary home, what's our first move? How do we take down someone like Victor Castellanos? Ryan studied the files she'd spread across the dining room table, recognizing the methodical organization of a military investigation. Captain Rodriguez had trained his daughter well, even if she'd never worn a uniform. We gather intelligence, Ryan said, falling back into the familiar rhythm of mission planning. We map his organization, identify key personnel, find weak points we can exploit. Then we build a case so airtight that even his money and connections can't save him. He looked up at Rebecca, seeing the determination in her eyes. But first, we make sure Zoe is safe. Everything else is secondary. Rebecca nodded, understanding the priority that drove him. I've already contacted a friend who runs a private security firm, former Secret Service, completely trustworthy. They'll provide discreet protection while we work. She hesitated, then added, I know this is asking a lot, bringing a child into something this dangerous, but I think she's safer with us than she would be alone. Ryan agreed, knowing that Castellanos wouldn't hesitate to use Zoe as leverage if he discovered her existence. Better to keep her close, where he could protect her directly than to leave her vulnerable and alone. It wasn't the life he'd planned for his daughter, but life had stopped following his plans the day his wife died. Daddy. Zoe appeared in the doorway, her arms full of art supplies. Can I paint a picture of Captain Rodriguez? I want to see what he looked like. The request hit Ryan like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. But maybe it was time to stop running from the past and start honoring it properly. I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart, he said, his voice slightly rough with emotion. I have some pictures on my phone that might help. As Zoe settled at the kitchen table with her paints, Ryan felt the final pieces of his old life clicking into place with his new one. This was what Captain Rodriguez would have wanted. He realized not justice for the soldiers who died, but a future for the ones who'd survived. 3 months later, Ryan Carter stood in a federal courthouse watching Victor Castellanos led away in handcuffs, finally brought to justice for the 47 soldiers whose deaths he'd caused through his greed and negligence. Rebecca's case had been airtight, built on the foundation of evidence her father had died gathering and strengthened by Ryan's tactical expertise and connections within the military community. The investigation had been dangerous, requiring all of Ryan's skills and training to keep them safe while they gathered the additional evidence needed to make their case bulletproof. There had been close calls, moments when Ryan thought they might not survive to see justice done, but they'd persevered together, united by their shared commitment to honoring the memory of Captain Benjamin Rodriguez. Now, as reporters clamored for statements and federal prosecutors celebrated their victory, Ryan found himself thinking not about the battle they'd just won, but about the life they'd built together. In the process, Rebecca had become more than an ally. She'd become family in the truest sense, someone who understood the weight of loss and the power of hope. Zoe had thrived in their unconventional household, her art becoming a bridge between past and present as she painted portraits of the heroes they fought to honor. Her picture of Captain Rodriguez hung in Rebecca's office now, a reminder of the man whose sacrifice had brought them all together and whose legacy would live on through the lives they'd saved. So, what now? Rebecca asked as they walked down the courthouse steps together, Zoe skipping between them with the unconscious joy of a child who knew she was loved and protected. Castellanos is finished. The families have justice, and the military, is implementing new oversight procedures to prevent this from happening again. Mission accomplished. Ryan looked at the woman who'd become his partner in every sense that mattered, and the daughter, who'd grown to love her as much as he did, and realized that the mission wasn't accomplished at all. It was just beginning. "Now we go home," he said simply. "All of us together." As they drove back to the farmhouse that had become their sanctuary, Ryan caught sight of their reflection in the rearview mirror. A family forged in crisis, strengthened by purpose, united by love that had grown from shared loss into shared hope. Captain Rodriguez would have been proud, Ryan thought, not just of the justice they'd achieved, but of the life they'd built, from the ashes of their grief. Romano's family restaurant still served their usual Friday night table, but now it was set for 3 instead of 2. Zoe still colored while she ate, but now her pictures included a new figure alongside her father, and the memory of her mother. Rebecca had learned to cut pizza into precisely the right-sized pieces, and Ryan had discovered that protecting his family didn't mean hiding from the world, but engaging with it on his own terms. The quiet plumber who'd once dismantled 3 attackers in 15 seconds was still there when needed. But most days, Ryan Carter was simply a father, a partner, and a man who'd learned that the greatest battles were often fought not with weapons, but with love, determination, and the courage to trust in something larger than yourself. Captain. Rodriguez's dog tags still hung around his neck, but now they felt less like a burden and more like a blessing, a reminder that some sacrifices create possibilities that the sacrificer never imagined. In saving Ryan's life, the captain had also saved Zoe's future and Rebecca's heart, creating ripples of hope that would spread far beyond anything he could have planned. As Zoe painted her latest masterpiece, a family portrait that included everyone she loved, living and dead, Ryan realized that this was what victory really looked like. Not the dramatic conclusion of a firefight, or the satisfaction of seeing an enemy defeated, but the quiet joy of watching his daughter grow up surrounded by love, knowing that the future he'd fought to protect was finally truly safe.